Well, thank you so much, Nick, for being here tonight. And of course, thank you so much for authoring this wonderful book. And of course, John was right. We're not just here to learn about it, we're also here to buy it. So if anybody would like to buy it up the front, I should have mentioned that it's $29.95 from our good friends at Dymocks. It basically traverses your arrival into Australia, how you've adapted to our culture and the idea that the fair go is a sort of unwritten constitution for this country, then looking at how the rise of an academic inner city elite has become a sort of sneering moral elite who governs the country. Why did you think this was important as a subject matter to discuss?
Well, I started really at the other end. I started in 2010, around the time of the election, and it dawned on me that something very different was happening at that election. It had been happening for some time, but it was in very stark relief that the country was deeply split, and not along, the lines you might think, left or right, or even quite city or country, although that's a factor in it. There was something cultural, some deep cultural divide. And the key to it was when I heard Frank Friede, my friend Frank Friede was here at a rival think tank, discussing, sorry, can you hear? Yeah. Discussing the European elite and how they'd really taken over the transnational project of the European Union and were running this thing with gay abandon with little reference to the people. And that was even before, of course, it really started to turn bad. But I set about looking at what was wrong with Australia. But in the process, as I was telling Geoffrey earlier, I felt as a newcomer I really wanted to go back and say, well, what was it like before in order to become what it was? And it started me on this really wonderful journey, I think, of cultural history, cultural archaeology, I call it, uncovering the layers of Australian society to find out where we'd come from. So it started back to front, and at that point it became really not so much a book about what's wrong with Australia, it was a book about what's right with it. And from there, the threat that we now face, I think.
Geoffrey, do you think Nick's portrayal of Australia before the rise of what he calls Bunyip alumni is accurate?
Well, speaking on behalf of the Bunyip alumni, yes, I have no strong disagreement with the spirit with which you describe the earlier Australia, and people may, weigh up the beans in different ways. But no, I think that in many previous times in Australian history, it was easier to debate important issues than it is today, and that's a very sad statement I have to make.
Miranda.
Just on that topic, you write about the idea of progressivism being a statement of moral superiority, which Geoffrey touched on. And this was all too evident in the emotive language used by Kevin Rudd, who once famously described his asylum seeker policy as removing a stain from the soul of this nation, and of course describing climate change as the greatest moral challenge of our time. The use of such emotive language consequently leaves no room for contrary opinion within public debate. Can you explain this phenomenon of moral superiority to us, and is it effective?
Well, I think I've been thinking about this recently in terms of Tony Abbott's position. Of course, he's a committed Catholic, but of course he seems to understand very well the sort of arrangement which we've struck between democracy, between parliamentary democracy and religion, and that is that you're not really allowed to go into the public forum and argue a position purely on the basis of your moral religious position. That's not good enough. I mean, you can work on it. You can back it up with other good public policy reasons, but you can't just go in and say, well, look, I'm against abortion, so everybody should be. But we've allowed this moralism to take hold with people who have no religion. So you're allowed to go in and say, well, morally, I think that it's only fair that it's an absolute moral right that everybody should have the chance to marry, and so on that basis, people will argue for same-sex marriage. I'm not arguing one way or another on same-sex marriage. It's just the way in which you argue, I think, which troubles me on that, and climate change. And as Geoffrey pointed out, I say in the book that, you know, if your position is moral and I have a different position, then I must be immoral, or at the very least amoral.
And people, therefore, in public debate are rather frightened to take what is immediately denounced as the immoral ground. We all like to have a vestige of morality in our possession. And the interesting thing is that even on matters of profound public interest, a government which takes the high moral ground can do things which are quite unimaginable. I think in the early 1990s, when they decided to bring an unknown soldier from France and bury him in the Australian War Memorial, and there was a lot to be said for the idea, and Mr. Keating was Prime Minister and I think made one of the great speeches of Australian history, written by Don Watson, I understand, but a fine speech, even though I don't agree with the history that was related in that speech. But he said that we don't know what religion that person was. Well, that's a very strange statement to make. After all, 98% of those who enlisted in the First World War were either Christian or Jewish. But because they could say, we don't know what religion he was, they took this person from sanctified ground, buried with a Christian burial or a Jewish burial, whatever it was, and brought him back to Australia and put him in unconsecrated ground. And I thought that we wouldn't, if I were an Aboriginal, I'd be astonished. But Australians, being not sure whether they should speak up, didn't really protest much. I got onto the I was appointed to the Australian War Memorial. I shouldn't really be saying this, but when I'd been there for a year, I thought this is wrong, it should be remedied, and without lobbying, I gave a notice that at the next meeting I would move that the inscription that was on his grave in France, whatever it was, should be put back here. I learned later it was known unto God, which is, I think, one of Kipling's magical phrases. It passed through the War Memorial, and they actually put it. It's there on the tomb of the unknown soldier, but it's eternally covered with flowers and wreaths. So that the victory is still theirs.
If anyone has a question, don't hesitate to put your hand up. The one thing, a quick follow-up to that, though, from both of you, is how much do you think this new moralism is by design, or how much of it is because of the absence of formalised religion within certain sections of the community?
Oh, I'd see it very much as the latter. It's and this is very interesting. Look, I've started to look at this sociology of religion as it applies to the irreligious, if you like, and I think it deserves a lot more work because it's absolutely key to it, as far as I can see. I mean, everybody needs a moral framework. You know, you just do in order to negotiate everyday life, so that you can agree with people what's what. But here's a generation that now more and more self-consciously reject any religious framework whatsoever, which of course is their right. But you can't. That's not enough. I mean, you still need a moral framework. And I'm very persuaded, I think, by some of the work of particularly Peter Berger and some of the American sociologists have looked at this and said, well, basically, when you have this irreligious generation going through universities, coming out without any tradition, they look for some off-the-peg package. And that's essentially, I think, what I see progressivism is, which is why that it takes on such a dogmatic characteristic. You know, you have to believe all the tenets. It wouldn't be possible to be a member, you know, accepted within the progressive grouping if you believed in climate change, but you didn't believe in the compulsory detention of, and also the compulsory detention of asylum seekers. You know, you have to believe the lot, otherwise you're thrown out. And some of us who have had this experience of being sort of basically cast out by progressive friends because we disagree with something on the Iraq War or one thing or another.
Yeah. Could I just ask you to say one thing more? Do you think this is increasing?
Well, it has been very noticeably increasing, and it's a very interesting thing in the last census. It shows that between 2001 and 2011, in certain constituencies, because I've looked at this in terms of federal constituencies like Wentworth, Grayndler, Melbourne, that the number of people who say they have no religion has increased dramatically, like by a factor of 60 or 70% in that 10 years. And that shows me something very interesting is happening. Because to say you have no religion doesn't mean you don't go to church or anything. You're just basically saying, well, I'm rejecting my traditional background. I mean, a lot of us might say, well, I'm Anglican because my family was Anglican, even if I don't go to church. But so to me, to say you have no religion is a very, very definite thing. So yes, it is increasing, and I'm not quite sure why.
I hadn't thought about this question in the way you lay it out in your book, so that since I've only read the book in the last week, I'm still digesting some of your ideas and still making my way, which is why it's a pleasure to be here and listening. But of course, part of the moral superiority comes originally from sections of religion, doesn't it? In the 19th century, if you looked for moral superiority in public debate, you might find it coming from various pulpits.
Well, yeah, you did, but I don't think exclusively from those pulpits. Particularly, I've been looking at the progressive, the first progressive movement in the United States, around about the beginning of the 20th century, and it has many of these same characteristics. And some of it is linked to Puritan religion and other religions, but some of it isn't. Some of it's just good progressive thought. So you get the rise of the temperance movement, for instance, and which leads to prohibition. And we've commonly thought, well, this is just the Americans, the God-bothering Americans. But no, it's not. When you look at the coalition of interests that pushed through prohibition, which was quite a big act. It was the church. It was the feminists, or it was a whole range of progressive causes all uniting together. So it's not the first time we've seen it, and I think to the point really.
We've noticed our roving mic isn't working, so I'm going to have to play TV host a bit. Phil, you had a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Leaving aside the academic battleground, shall we say, and focusing more on the common man, it's amazing that the substance of your book echoes with so much of what I've been grappling with in my studies to understand where we're at. And I just offer for people's consideration the grassroots, evangelism isn't the right word, but interface. And whenever I hear someone say lucky country, I have said, would you like a smack in the face? And they say, Brabham, what are you on about? And that's my opportunity, having gained their attention, to say, you've just insulted 5 generations of my ancestors who busted their britches to provide the most valued standard of living in the world, and you think it happened by accident? I think you need to go and live in a cave on a South Atlantic island. Let some poor Burmese guy or Indonesian whatever come in here, embrace our values, and preserve the gift of freedom for all future generations, wherever they come from. I've commended that to you. Can I invite your endorsement in part or in whole? As you see fit.
Well, I suggest we should perhaps all rise and sing the national anthem, because that does endorse this sentiment. We have golden soil but wealth for toil, and that's the nub of it.
We've got a question from Ray Evans.
It's interesting that religion has become the dominant issue of our discussion so far this evening. I wonder if any of the panellists could tell us when and how did it happen that sometime during the 1960s, I think, religion suddenly began to go down in the significance which it previously had in Australian life?
Either.
It's a very difficult question to answer. I'm inclined to think that the people represented here and their parents and their grandparents are the first generation where the overwhelming majority of people in a nation had no serious material wants. The transformation in this land since, let's say, 1940 or the 1960s, which Donald Horne derides as lacking in progress. I mean, in material progress, that's the most astonishing period in the history of the world. And Australia, more than almost any country, has been the beneficiary, whether it's we have enough to eat, more than enough to eat. We can travel, a wonderful privilege for the first time an ordinary Australian can travel. We've been given length of life, most of these things coming from science and technology. And when for the first time you experience material success on this scale, I think materialism and the science, which is often the progenitor, are venerated to an absurd degree. And I think there's a lot of truth in the statement, I'm not sure is it the New Testament or the Old Testament, that mankind or man cannot live by bread alone. But we're the first generation which thinks that maybe we can live by bread alone. And I would be surprised if materialism reigned so triumphantly in 50 years' time in most countries of the Western world. I could be wrong, but this is a unique facet of history.
Miranda.
Sure. Now, Nick, I'd just like to move on to the topic of higher education as a commodity. You quote British academic Joanna Williams, who states that today's students merely seek to have a degree rather than be learners, and attend university to claim their entitlements rather than to become independent thinkers. Is this just a passing trend in the midst of our so-called education revolution? And if so, what can be done to restore the virtues of a liberal education to academic pursuits?
I wish I could say it was a passing trend. It's not. It's a deep historical trend, really, that's going from the 60s onwards. You know, the progression from Menzies' idea of higher education as, you know, what we'd think of as a classical liberal education, to what we have now, this sort of building of human capital, this sort of deeply utilitarian idea where it's almost like, you know, any utility, it's like electricity or water, well, let's create brains and just create a pool of you know, you only got to listen, I think, to the rhetoric.
The ultimate commodification.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. The rhetoric of people like Julia Gillard to really, well, it chills me to the bone, quite frankly. But going along with this has been this narrative which is set in Australia particularly, although I think in other countries, I think for historical reasons it's particularly strong here, this idea that going to university is the great social elevator that lifts you out of your background. And of course the myth of Whitlam's free education and how this was supposed to lift generations of people who couldn't possibly have gone to university into the university stratosphere. And I think I show pretty categorically, I don't think I'll persuade anybody who believes that view, but pretty categorically from the statistics which I present in the book, you can see that that's just not true. That the effect of free education was a massive spike in the number of admissions to university, but no spike, you know, 3 or 4 years later in the number of degrees awarded. So it has become, I think, a sort of dominant paradigm. We've just got to shift it. I just don't think it's not quite the same in countries like Germany. I mean, they're quite happy with the idea that some people go into an academic stream and other people go into a technical stream, and they make jolly good cars. So I think I don't know how you shift it, but it, you know, it can do us no good if we carry on this path, as far as I can see.
Professor Blainey, do you have a comment?
Education is great, but one wonders how great it is. I don't want to pull down Mr. Rudd or Ms. Gillard. I mean, they're good citizens, and no doubt they have the good of the nation at heart in their own way. But when you think they're excellent products of our modern education system. And would anyone say that they were superior prime ministers to predecessors in the Labor Party, Mr. Geoffrey and Mr. Curtin, who left school at a very early age, but kept on reading and kept on learning?
And, sorry.
Just one more thing on that. I mean, I look back to 1957 when Menzies looked to expand higher education. He pulled over Sir Keith Murray from Britain to survey higher education, and Murray came back and said, "Well, look, you haven't got enough people going to university." I think it was 4.5 out of every 100 children in New South Wales went on to university. He said the best international standards would say you want about 17% going to university, and that seemed a reasonable total, and they aimed for it because we shot right past that. We're now at 25% plus or more, I think, and the government, if it has its way, would like it to make that 40%. Now, what are we saying? Are we saying that people have suddenly got enormously more intelligent, or are we saying we're actually over-educating a lot of people?
Thank you very much for that. A question to Nick. It only came out last week, but the Julia Gillard National Curriculum, Civics and Citizenship, talks about a lot. We're multi-faith, we're multicultural, we have diversity and difference. It doesn't mention religion except for 1 or 2 times, and when it does, it talks about the religion of Asian Australians, and Indigenous peoples. It doesn't talk about Christianity at all. Now, Nick, why has that happened and what can we do about it? Because this is a compulsory curriculum, if the government gets its way, that every school, as a condition of funding, will have to implement.
Yeah, well, you know, a lot of us are having some doubts about the whole idea of a national curriculum. Maybe it should have been, we should have left things as they were. But look, I honestly don't know, Kevin. I only sort of signal that this is something that I don't think we've really registered, that the attack on religion is somehow central to what's happening at the moment. It's no accident that every single night of the week, virtually, the lead story on Lateline is some attack on some wayward Catholic priest who did something bad. That's not accidental. This is all part of what a feeling that religion is somehow morally evil, you know, and goodness knows how that crept in. A good friend at Wollongong University said to me, well, look, the trouble is that there's any absence of the transcendence now in anything. We're not allowed to sort of surrender to the transcendent in our thinking. And I think there's something in that. But look, that's far beyond where this book goes. I just sort of invite people to pick up that discussion. Professor
Blainey, do you have any thoughts on the national curriculum?
Well, the big argument in favour of the national curriculum, as I heard it, was that people moving interstate, and especially Army and Air Force people, were profoundly disadvantaged, and especially their children. And that was the strongest argument I used to hear when I was actually on one of these national curriculum working bees. I think when you have a federation, one of the great advantages of federation is that you have diversity, and you've devised an education system suited to the people and to the climate and to the history and the geography of your own particular region. I really think the idea of a national curriculum is the idea that would appeal especially to a socialist.
That said, I think I'm all for the national curriculum if somebody wants to put my book on it, but I just throw that out.
I know there's some questions over here, but just getting back to that idea of progressivism that now seems to dominate our political culture. I always sort of talk about progressivism as a fundamentally intellectually bankrupt political philosophy, because to me it has no consistency, and consistency does actually matter a little bit to make things predictable and fair for the public that we would ordinarily say the government serves, but in their case perhaps sometimes you would argue rules over. Do you think this is a fundamental failure of progressivism as a political ideology, particularly when you talk about everyone having to sign up to every dimension of it in order to sort of be able to be a participant of it? How do you then deal with the inconsistencies?
Well, it's interesting. The whole idea of progressivism doesn't... I mean, it was curious to me that you got this word progressive, and it doesn't actually speak of progress. But I think actually since writing the book, I think I've come down to pin down what's going on here. You know, in the 19th century and early 20th century, really up until, the 50s and 60s, there was no distinction between economic, scientific, industrial, and material and social progress. It all sort of went hand in hand. So you get, as I cite in the book, the development of frozen meat. And of course, this is a scientific development. It's also an economic development. You know, Australia can make a lot of money selling frozen meat in London. But in the way they speak about it at the time, it also sees enormous social progress, as indeed it was. I mean, it vastly improved the diet of the working classes in Britain. So it was all three, and nobody seemed to see. I'm sure Geoffrey would know more than I would, but nobody seemed to see any distinction. But suddenly with progressivism, we get this idea that the only or the most important thing is social progress. We have these social causes we have to fight, completely divorced from economics or material or scientific progress. And we're now at a point, I think, where even economic progress is seen as bad thing. You know, I mean, it's wrong for people to make money. It's wrong for mining companies to generate wealth. This so-called wealth should be put into social progress. So I think it's that divorcing of the different strands of progress. We need to somehow pull those together and convince people that with a more prosperous society can be a more socially progressive one.
We have a question down here with...
Just on this topic, there's a relatively recent trend of using altruistic human rights vehicles as an aggressive and unquestionable assault on the national conscience. Members of the educated elite point to authorities such as international law as a means to circumventing the majority rule of democratic institutions. In your opinion, is this the height of symbolism over substance within the educated elite?
Yeah, well, it's a very important point in the book, and I come back to the idea that we have to maintain the idea of sovereignty and citizenship, which is not a word we talk about much in Australia, is it? The Americans talk about it all the time. But I think we have to go back to this, because really until the 70s, it was there was no question that the idea that you had benefits from living in a state, but you also had responsibilities, and these two things went to be a good citizen. But since then, we've seen the development of this idea of a world citizen, where you have no responsibility towards the state, but you have some, amorphous sort of responsibility to the broad sweep of humanity. Now that's too big an idea for most of us to get our heads around, I think. And people have said this over the years, but we need to come back to this idea of our own sovereignty and resist all the time this idea that you hear it from Bob Brown, that's against international law. Australia's going to be condemned in the court of international public opinion. Like what court?
What countries?
By what countries? I just want politicians to come back all the time and forcefully say, we are elected to govern in this country, and we will set the rules for this country. And the other, of course, we have to take our responsibilities seriously, and insofar as the United Nations and those bodies do accomplish some things, we do that. But I'm sorry, we can't let those things overrule the wish of our people.
Could I just draw a couple of those strands of yours together? It seems to me that any worthwhile religion traditionally and any worthwhile secular moral code put great emphasis on personal responsibility. This is your life and you have to do something with it. If things go wrong, maybe you're partly or largely to blame. And one of the great changes that's come, especially since the 1980s, is that responsibilities have slipped out of the political vocabulary, and the idea that you can have rights, that everyone can be given rights as in a Bill of Rights, with nobody bearing the responsibilities that are reservoirs from which the rights have to be watered or fed. I mean, that's one of the most astonishing changes of our time, and that's one of the...
We have a question from Sue McNeil.
Quick question. Nick, how much is the high moral ground designed by the manipulators of huge wealth?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, that's not a view that I'd take. Quite the opposite, in fact. I think that the high moral ground is taken by the middle classes, as it always has been. There's sort of basically three ways you can rule a country. One is through military or force, to keep people down by force. The other is by sort of, using your wealth to keep yourself in power, or you can use it through cultural power. And I think cultural power, which is what we see exercised nowadays, is the key dynamic. So, Gina Reinhardt, for instance, is often vilified. I'm not here to support Gina Reinhardt, but just to say that she is vilified unfairly, I think, very often, and she has no comeback except by buying adverts in the paper. She has to buy her space. She's not given, an open go on radio and television. So I think quite the opposite. I think cultural power is closely held and restricted to a certain group, and it's not the wealthy.
But isn't this part of the challenge now, is that, yes, you have very wealthy individuals, but of course you also have people who are in charge of government have a very large amount of money and dole it out left, right and centre to their allies and to their friends to make sure that they can perpetuate their position. And you see a lot of this, I think, arguably with the current government we have in Canberra, where they give enormous amounts of support to their friends, and then that perpetuates their voice in public debate, even though they're supposed to be, quote, independent.
Yeah, well, that's a big factor, and this is something we can do something about if we elect governments that are prepared to take this on. This is the massive sort of industry we now have of lobbyists and I mean, look, take the environment for instance. I haven't done the sums; it's too big, but it would be an industry. The environmental lobby is an industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars a year. That's their turnover. The two biggest groups, the Wilderness Society and the Australian Conservation Society, between them got a budget of about 150 million and enormous number of full-time staff. Now they persuaded us that they're not the vested interest of the mining companies. But look, these people, if you earn a comfortable salary of 200,000 or whatever, running a climate change institute, you've got every bit as vested interest in keeping this subject going as the mining companies, because you'll be out of a job. So I think, and the extent to which these things are supported by government and so forth, we need to think very, very carefully. Victoria's a hotbed for this, I have to say, through various things that the Victorian government's created. But we've got to look at this very carefully, because in the end, you're spending money to promote special interests.
We've got a question with here, Mike Rawlinson, but while we're doing that, Professor Blainey, I want to ask you, has there been a change in the idea of what independence has become in public discourse between people who used to be free from government, and now anyone who's attached to government automatically gets a sense of independence, even though they're no more independent than the groups that Nick was outlining?
Could you add another sentence?
Do you think there's been a change in independence and the concept of independence between those who are funded by the public sector and those funded by the private sector?
What do you think?
I have a very strong view, but I am here to ask questions, not to answer.
You tell me what you think, and then I'll tell you.
I do.
Do you? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I haven't thought enough about the question to be completely confident, but I understand your point of view.
Okay, Mike.
Nick, today the government announced a ballot to go to Gallipoli in 2015 for the centenary. It's good that volunteers are going again this time. Do you have any findings in relation to the Anzac tradition and what the cultural elite thinks of the military?
Oh, well, that is an interesting one, and we've seen it, of course, recently with the lead up to the centenary of Anzac landings in 2015. There's been quite a concerted attack from various peace studies groups and so forth to get on board and to see this as a celebration of peace studies or something. There is I think a very strong attack on what we see as the Anzac tradition, or what I see, and I would take it most of us would share, and a view that it is a militaristic sort of celebration. I've never ever seen it like that. I don't think a lot of migrants see this as a day of celebrating the national character, the national quality. It was defeat, after all. It wasn't a triumph. And through I think popular acclaim, this has become the day we celebrate. So I think we have to be on our guard, very much on our guard against what you suggest. Yeah.